name and how old you are.
My name is Jonbenet Ramsey, and I'm 5 minutes. My name is Jonbenet Ramsey. My name is Jonbenet Ramsey. My name is Jonbenet Ramsey, and I'm 5 minutes. 5.5.
Jonbenet Ramsey was just 6 years old when she was killed at her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. It was Christmas Day 1996, and the Ramseys had had dinner at their friend's house. Everyone was in bed by 10:30 p.m. since they had to get up early to fly to Michigan the next day. But the next morning, Jonbenet was missing from her bed, and a ransom note claiming she had been kidnapped was found on the stairs. But a few hours later, Jonbenet was found dead in the basement. Did the Ramseys kill their daughter, or was it an intruder? Jonbenet Patricia Ramsey was born August 8, 1990. Her name derived from her father, Jonbenet Ramsey, and her mother, Patricia Ramsey, who went by Patsy. She loved singing, tap dancing, dressing up, and at one point she wanted to play the violin. She had dreams of being a figure skater when she was older. Jonbenet was kind and generous. One time at school there wasn't enough cupcakes to go around, and the teacher asked for volunteers to share, and Jonbenet was the first to raise her hand. Her mother, Patsy, was a former beauty queen and had been Miss West Virginia in 1977. She was invited back to be a judge during one of the pageant's anniversaries, and she took Jonbenet with her. Apparently, Jonbenet had such a good time that she wanted to be in a pageant herself. She was in 8 to 10 pageants before she died, usually winning the talent competition which she usually sang in. John said she hardly ever won because she was so young, but Jonbenet did win titles of America's Royale Miss, Little Miss Charlevoix, Little Miss Colorado, Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl, and National Tiny Miss Beauty. That's quite a lot of winning. John said he didn't like that she wore makeup, but he thought it was just another level of dress-up that she liked to do. He said the pageants were a fun mother and daughter thing that she and Patsy did together on the weekends. It was never that serious, he said, just something fun. But Patsy took Jonbenet to get professional photos taken more than once. She used these photos, called character shots, to enter different pageant categories, so it was somewhat serious. Though their housekeeper said Jonbenet loved being in pageants. If she didn't want to go, Patsy didn't make her. John said he always encouraged Jonbenet's talent and told her that it didn't matter if she was the prettiest. When asked by police what he thought about some of the pageant girls acting provocatively, John said, "It's in the eye of the beholder. If you look at a little girl in a dress and think something sexual, you got a problem." Jonbenet's father, John Ramsey, was president and CEO of Access Graphics, a software company that became a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin in 1991. Lockheed's largest customer is the US Department of Defense, for which they provide products like fighter jets and missiles. John grew up in Michigan, and after graduating from Michigan State University, he joined the Navy and served as an officer in the Philippines for 3 years, and then in an Atlanta Reserve unit for 8 years. Before Patsy, John was married to Lucinda Pash for 12 years. However, he had an affair with a secretary, and they got divorced. He had 3 children with Lucinda, Beth, Melinda, and John Andrew. Unfortunately, Beth died at the age of 22 in a car crash, 5 years before Jonbenet's death. Patsy Ramsey was from West Virginia and was in a sorority at West Virginia University where she graduated with a degree in journalism. She was 20 years old when she won the title of Miss West Virginia. She also won the talent competition in the Miss America pageant. Her talent in both pageants was acting. She said, "My talent is a dramatic interpretation that I wrote based on a portion of the prime of Miss Jean Brodie. I play 2 characters, Miss McKay, the stern-haired mistress, and Jean Brodie, the eccentric, vivacious schoolteacher." Patsy was 23 when she married John, who was 36. Burke Ramsey was John and Patsy's first child together. He was 9 years old when Jonbenet died. On the 6th of December, Jonbenet took part in a Christmas parade. She was in a little float with her name on the side. It was a small parade of children, all dressed up, and people lined the streets of Boulder watching. Later, John would say that this was a mistake, and he was naive, not realizing that there are freaks out there, that they were exposing Jonbenet. Each year, the Ramseys hosted a Christmas party, but they weren't going to do it this year because they already had a lot going on, and according to John, they were partied out. But their usual Santa, Bill McReynolds, said that a documentary filmmaker was following him around and he really wanted him to see the Ramseys' Christmas party because it was one of his favourites. So John and Patsy decided to throw a small party for parents and their kids. Santa and Mrs. Santa came and they had food and little presents for Jonbenet, Burke and their friends. Housekeeper Linda Hoffman-Pugh and her daughter were also at the party, and at some point that day, Linda took Patsy's paint tray down to the basement. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, the Ramseys' housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, phoned the Ramseys and spoke to Patsy. She had a fight with her sister and was upset and asked to borrow $2,000. Patsy had lent her money before, so she agreed and left a check for her to pick up in the kitchen. At around 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, John, Patsy, Jonbenet and Burke went to church. Afterwards, they went to one of their favourite restaurants for dinner, Pastor Jay's. The Ramseys went to Pastor Jay's at least once a week. After leaving the restaurant, the family decided to drive up to the Boulder Star, a viewing point above the city. It was Christmas Eve, and they wanted to see all the lights dazzling in the night sky. On their way home, they stopped by their friend's house for a few minutes. This was the house of Fleet and Priscilla White, who had children around the same age as Burke and Jonbenet. John and Fleet became fast friends when they met a couple of years before. They both were businessmen who enjoyed sailing and frequently went out together on their boats. After saying hello, the Ramseys went home and they put the kids to bed. John and Patsy made sure all of the presents were out. Burke and Jonbenet had individual piles, and there were a lot of presents for them. The gifts from family were wrapped, but presents from Santa were not, as was Patsy's Christmas tradition. Jonbenet got a bike from Santa that year. It was a green one, specifically made for little girls. John went across the street to the Barnhill's house where he was hiding the bike, and he retrieved it from their basement. Patsy also got a bike that Christmas, and John got it out of the garage and put it under the tree. Once all the gifts were in place, they went to bed. On Christmas Day, Burke and Jonbenet woke their parents up around 6 a.m. They were excited and wanted to open their presents. John made them wait a few minutes while he went downstairs to turn on the Christmas lights and put on some music. He thought it was fun to make them wait a little longer. Once he was ready, he called them downstairs, and Jonbenet was so excited when she saw her new green bike waiting for her. Burke's big present that year was a Nintendo 64, and later that day he would set it up and begin playing. Some of the neighbourhood kids, including the Colby brothers, came over and played it with Burke. Jonbenet also received a doll that was specially made to look like her, but she didn't like it very much. Patsy gave John a painting that year, which he planned to take with them to their lake house in Charlevoix, Michigan, the next day. After they opened their presents, they had pancakes for breakfast, and then Jonbenet and Burke played with their toys. Patsy spent some time in the basement wrapping presents for John's older children from his first marriage. They were Melinda and John Andrew, and they would be flying from Atlanta to Minneapolis the next day. The plan was to meet the older children in Minneapolis and then continue the journey to the lake house where they would have a second Christmas. After 2 days, they were going to fly back home and then fly out to Orlando for their cruise on Disney's Big Red Boat on the 29th, which was also Patsy's birthday. Patsy was wrapping their gifts and some little ones for Burke and Jonbenet, while John went to the airplane hangar for a couple of hours. He owned a private plane, a C-90 King Air, worth between $1 and $2 million in today's money, which he leased to a charter company called Mountain Aviation. The family were going to fly it out to Michigan at 7 a.m. the next day, so John went to take some of the wrapped presents to load the plane. He also spent some time cleaning it, not necessarily because the plane needed cleaning, but because he just liked spending time with it. According to John, he spent a couple of hours there. At about 4 p.m, the Ramseys took Patsy's white Jaguar and they went to the Whites' house. Fleet and Priscilla had extended family staying with them, and the Ramseys were invited over for Christmas dinner. It would be the second Christmas in a row they spent with the Whites. There were several tables set up, and they served cracked crab, which Jonbenet liked. That night, Patsy was wearing black velvet pants, a red turtleneck sweater, and a grey, black and red checkered jacket. This is important to remember. By her own admission, she wanted Jonbenet to wear a matching outfit, but she didn't want to. This caused a little argument between them. Patsy didn't drink, and John had 1 or 2 glasses of wine, which he said he sipped slowly. After dinner, John and Fleet White sat on the floor and helped their daughters make some jewellery. Between 8:30 and 9 p.m, the Ramseys left the Whites' house, but they didn't go home right away. They had some gifts to give their other friends, the Walkers, the Steins, and the Fernies. They drove to the Walkers first, and Patsy went in for 5 to 10 minutes to give the gifts. Then they went to the Steins. The Fernies lived further out, and since it was getting late, they decided to go home. Jonbenet had fallen asleep in the car, and when they arrived home, John said he struggled to get her out of the car because she was completely out. He carried her up to the bedroom and laid her on her bed. Patsy came in behind him and dressed her for bed. She found some long johns which she dressed her in, and left her top on that she was already wearing. They usually left Jonbenet's bathroom light on, or they had a little lamp in there which they sometimes used as a nightlight. Patsy left Jonbenet's door partially open. She then went to finish packing and get the final things ready for the trip the next day. Meanwhile, Burke went straight to his toys when they got home, and John could see that it was going to be hard to get him to leave them and go to bed. So to move things along, he helped Burke set up a toy for 10 to 20 minutes. Once they were done, he took Burke upstairs, helped him brush his teeth and put him to bed. He left his door partially open. Once John and Patsy had finished putting the kids to bed and were done packing the final things for the trip, they went up to bed themselves. Their bedroom was on the 3rd floor, and they each had their own bathroom. Patsy said she washed her face and brushed her teeth, and left the clothes that she was wearing draped over the bathtub. She doesn't usually remove jewellery before bed, she said. John got ready for bed in his own bathroom, and said that when Patsy takes off her clothes, she doesn't put them away. When asked by police what does Patsy do with her clothes, he said, where it lands is where it stays, and she usually left her clothes over the tub. The housekeeper, Linda Hoffman, also said something similar, saying that the Ramseys didn't even have a laundry hamper, that they would leave their dirty clothes all over the floor. John described Patsy as the sleep queen, because as soon as she closed her eyes, he said, she would fall asleep. Wanting to doze off right away since they had to be up early, John took a melatonin. He got into bed and read a few pages of his book before turning off the light. Patsy was already asleep. During the night, a neighbour reportedly heard a child scream. They didn't know exactly what time it was, but guessed it was between midnight and 2 a.m. An alarm was set for 5:30 a.m, but John woke 5 minutes before it, at 5:25 a.m. He got up and went to his bathroom, where he took a shower. Patsy woke up at the same time as soon as John got out of bed. She got up, went to her bathroom. She didn't take a shower, but she picked up her black velvet pants and red turtleneck she threw over the tub and put them back on. She explained to police that she usually wore some items 2 to 3 times before taking them to the dry cleaners. She hated doing laundry. She said that because it was so early in the morning, she planned to get ready properly once they arrived at the lake house. According to her, she spent 10 to 20 minutes in the bathroom, where she also brushed her teeth, brushed her hair, and put on a bit of makeup. She put on some foundation, blush, and lipstick. She said she only wanted to put a bit on and then go, but planned to do her makeup properly later that day. She then went to the laundry room for 5 to 10 minutes, where she found some clothing of Jonbenet's that she planned to take to the dry cleaners once they got back from their trip. Then she made her way downstairs to make coffee. While going down the spiral staircase, she noticed 3 sheets of paper laid out on one of the steps. She stepped over it, then turned around and began reading it. It was a ransom letter addressed to John, and whoever wrote it said they had Jonbenet. Patsy read only a few lines, getting to the part where it said they had her daughter. She was able to glance at the rest of the note, she said, and saw they were demanding $118,000, and the signature said Victory, SBTC. She screamed for John and ran back up the stairs. John was either brushing his teeth or combing his hair, he said, when he rushed to Patsy and met her halfway down the spiral stairs. What is it? He asked. Patsy said they had Jonbenet. Patsy checked her bedroom, and Jonbenet wasn't in her bed. John checked on Burke, but luckily he was still sleeping safe and sound. He also checked the walk-in refrigerator because they said they were always afraid the kids would get stuck in there since it had a heavy door. Patsy asked John what to do, and he said to call the police. He took the note and laid it out on the floor so he could read the whole thing quickly and all at once. Hunched over the note in his underwear, he began reading the whole letter. Just around the corner, Patsy dialed 911.
911 emergency.
Police.
What's going on?
5515th Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There, we have a There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old.
How long ago was this?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Kathy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been
No,
gone?
I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, there's somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath
Please,
away, okay?
hurry.
Patsy.
It doesn't seem unusual that Patsy says my daughter and not Jonbenet's name. If she had said Jonbenet is missing, that's not helpful because the operator would then have to ask who is Jonbenet. She could have said my daughter Jonbenet, but saying my daughter is enough to get the information across, and if the operator wanted to know her name, she would have asked. Patsy actually does give the relevant information across. She says her daughter is missing and she's 6 years old, blonde. She says she's the mother rather than her mother, which is a bit odd. It sounds detached, like she's distancing herself. But what's weirder is that Patsy stops responding to the operator and then hangs up. Normally, you'd stay on the phone until the operator says it's okay to hang up or the ambulance has arrived. And if Patsy is trying to get help, why isn't she hanging on the operator's every word? You would think Patsy would want to hear any advice the operator gives them. There is much speculation surrounding Patsy telling the operator that the ransom letter was signed SBTC. Patsy said she only read the first few lines of the note, so how did she know that it was signed SBTC? Some people think this is evidence that she wrote the letter and was recalling the signature from memory. But John was reading the letter just around the corner in the hallway to where Patsy was standing while on the phone, and the phone has a long cord, so she may have been able to stand close to John and see it. Additionally, she's speaking slowly, as if reading each letter aloud carefully. Then she pauses and says victory, as if she glanced up on the page and read that word. She did say she glanced at the rest of the note before she shouted for John to come downstairs, so maybe she remembered it from that, and we don't know if John read parts of it out loud before she dialed 911. If she was recalling from memory because she wrote it, surely she would know that it was signed Victory SBTC and not SBTC Victory, which she tells the operator. After the 911 call, John goes upstairs and puts on pants and a shirt. Patsy calls their friends, the Whites and the Fernies, and tells them that Jonbenet is gone and they need to come over. Just a few minutes later, Officer French arrived at the Ramsey house at 5:55 a.m. Before we continue with the events that day, let's look at what the ransom letter said. Please keep in mind that much of what I interpret in this section is simply my own opinion. First, what was the purpose of the letter? If an intruder intended to kidnap Jonbenet, they might have written the letter first, but then killed her and ended up leaving her in the house. Or they might have killed Jonbenet first and written the letter afterwards to buy time and direct everyone to look outside the house. If the Ramseys wrote the letter, then it's possible they were trying to cover up the murder and make it look like an intruder had done it. It's also possible that only one of the Ramseys was involved and the other had no idea, in which case the letter may have been written to direct attention away from the house until they could dispose of her body. So what points to the Ramseys writing the ransom letter? Patsy and John had their own separate notepads. The ransom letter was written on paper from Patsy's notepad. Once the author had finished writing it, they put the pen and paper back in their original places. Interestingly, the author also wrote a practice note. They had started the letter addressing it to Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, but changed their mind and addressed the final letter to Mr. Ramsey. The letter was 2.5 pages long and filled with flowery language and movie references. It is quite the spectacle. The author requests $118,000. They tell John to bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. The word attaché is French, and people speculate that Patsy would have used a word like this, but many people did. In the mid-90s, it wasn't uncommon to use the word attaché or attaché case by Americans as well, not just French people. But why request the money to be transferred to a paper bag that could easily get wet or torn? Put the money in the bag sounds like a cliché. The $118,000 is more strange. The amount of money they demand is low and specific. Why not round it up to $120,000? And John was a multi-millionaire. The author could have asked for much more. John received a bonus from work of $118,223 the previous year, and it was recorded on all of his pay stubs throughout 1996. Patsy claimed she didn't know John got a bonus, and that is possible. It seems like Patsy was not directly involved in the family's financial affairs. John took care of all of that, so maybe she didn't know, but his pay stubs were in the house and she would have known where to find them. The letter continues, and the author says they will call between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. Why do they care about John's well-being? Someone who cares about John, like Patsy, might say this. The letter begins by saying, "We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction," which is a long-winded way of saying we are a group. But the voice of the letter shifts from a we to an I when the intruder says, "I will call you tomorrow between 8 and 10. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter." So clearly the author forgot that they were meant to be writing on behalf of a group. Who might do this? An individual writing a fake ransom letter might do that, but this doesn't necessarily point to Patsy. It could be any individual. The handwriting also starts off more shaky, with several spelling mistakes, but as the letter goes on, the writing becomes more steady, and probably more like the author's actual writing if they were trying to conceal it in the beginning. Again, this doesn't necessarily point to Patsy, but the shakiness of the writing could be because the author was feeling stressed and anxious. But there are a couple of noteworthy sentences in the letter that do seem to point to Patsy. Patsy was a former pageant queen, Miss West Virginia 1977, and winner of the talent contest in Miss America. Patsy's talent in the pageants was a dramatic interpretation of the novel The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. She knew the novel well. In that novel, there are some sentences worth noting, such as, Sandy screamed. Monica, whose face was becoming very red, swung the attaché case which held her books. And the speciality of the feast was pineapple cubes with cream. In the ransom letter, one of the misspelled words was possession. John said that Patsy would never have spelt that wrong, but in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, one of the characters says, "I can't remember how to spell possession." Did Patsy write the letter and recall the words that she had read and memorized time and time again? Another interesting sentence in the letter is, "You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult." John was part of a friend group in Atlanta where the Ramseys used to live. After Jonbenet's funeral, John was at his friend Bob Westmoreland's house, which he described as beautiful, and he said that Bob made a lot of money. John's friends were consoling him, and they were also at the house, and John said that to be part of that group you had to be wealthy yourself. John said the nickname for that friend group was the Atlanta Fat Cats. So is that line in the ransom letter, "You're not the only fat cat around," a coincidence, a common turn of phrase, or is it more personal than that? And if it is, who would know that John was part of the Atlanta Fat Cats? Well, Patsy might have. A line in the ransom letter reads, "Use that southern common sense of yours." Now, John was originally from Michigan, so he wasn't a southerner like Patsy, so why would Patsy tell him to use his southern common sense? Well, it could be an inside joke between them. If John had spent so many years living in the South, Patsy may have teasingly called him a southerner now. It could have been playful banter to tell him to use his southern common sense. But is there anything in the letter that points towards an intruder being the author? Well, since the letter was addressed to John, it's possible that Jonbenet's death could have been an act of revenge. If someone hated John for whatever reason, then they probably knew quite a bit about him. Perhaps they were aware that John was given $118,000 for his bonus, and assumed that he would have it sitting in his bank account in cash, which would be easily withdrawn. Perhaps that's why that amount was requested, rather than waiting for John to faff around trying to get a larger amount. But it's still an odd amount to request. If the killer was somebody who hated John, they would surely know that he had a lot more money, and wouldn't $1 million be worth the wait? It's possible that if someone hated John, they might know or have heard the term Atlanta Fat Cats, but it's unknown if that nickname was ever spoken outside of that group. The line that reads, "Use that southern common sense of yours," could have been written by someone who knew that the Ramseys used to live in Atlanta. By his own admission, John considered Atlanta home, and he had lived there for many years, so it's not a stretch that an intruder might tell him to use his southern common sense, thinking that he's from the South. The line, "Don't try to grow a brain, John," is similar to the line in the movie Speed, "Don't attempt to grow a brain." But the Ramseys hadn't seen this movie. It came out in 1994, and John saw it on a flight once, but he didn't have headphones, so he only saw it without the sound. Remember, planes back then didn't have individual screens, so he wouldn't have been able to turn on the subtitles. In the letter, there are lines that appear to be influenced by movies, such as Dirty Harry or Ransom, but no exact quotes. John said that he saw Dirty Harry years and years before, but couldn't remember much of it. The movie Ransom was in theatres at the time of Jonbenet's death, but John said they didn't see movies at the theatres. It was too difficult with kids, and they tended to rent movies once they came out on video 6 months to a year later. John said he liked movies that involved boats and planes, but it was always difficult to find something that both he and Patsy would watch. His favourite movie was African Queen. So would the Ramseys have seen these types of movies enough where they would remember lines? It's unlikely, unless John was lying. But it can't be denied that the author was at least influenced by movies when writing this letter. The letter is written as if the author's only knowledge of kidnappings or terrorist groups is what they've seen in movies. A lot of the lines read like cliches, but of course we're looking at it through a lens almost 30 years later. Perhaps in 1996, the letter wouldn't have seemed so laughable. Regarding the signature SBTC, no one has been able to figure it out. Some people think it could be Subic Bay Training Center, where John was stationed decades before in the Philippines, although that's not its official name. Some people think it could be a biblical reference, like Saved by the Cross or St. Barbara the Christian. But it could also be random letters. The author of the letter claimed they were a group of individuals, so perhaps SBTC are random letters made to appear like initials of 4 people involved. What about the handwriting, though? One of the main reasons people speculate that Patsy is the author of the ransom letter is the similarities in handwriting. Several handwriting experts compared samples from John and Patsy. They also had them write the ransom letter in their own writing using both their left and right hands. It's hard to deny that there are similarities between Patsy's writing and the letter. However, there are also differences too. A civil suit was brought against the Ramseys by Robert Christian Wolfe because allegedly the Ramseys had implied on national TV that he killed Jonbenet. In that case, Judge Carnes granted the Ramseys' motion for handwriting expert Sina Wong's analysis to be excluded. Sina Wong was a board-certified handwriting expert in West Virginia who had analysed Patsy's handwriting. Her analysis showed 32 points of comparison and similarities from 7 samples of Patsy's handwriting and the ransom letter. She said the relatively large number of distinctive similarities found in both the ransom note and exemplars allegedly written by Patsy Ramsey cannot be ignored. Statistically, it can only be concluded that it is very likely the same hand wrote all the documents involved. But Judge Carnes noted that Sina Wong had never seen the original ransom letter. Wong received her copy of the ransom letter and certain writings alleged to be historical writings of Patsy from the tabloid The National Enquirer. The judge said, in addition to Mrs. Ramsey, there were other individuals under suspicion who had the handwriting analysed and who were not eliminated as the possible author of the note, including the plaintiff. Both parties in that civil suit agreed that the ransom letter was not an ideal sample to analyse, since it was written with a felt pen, which can mask fine details and distortions. The judge concluded that the writer does not appear to have been trying to disguise his or her handwriting. Additionally, the judge noted that the Boulder Police Department hired 4 handwriting experts and the Ramseys hired 2 experts. All of them examined the original ransom letter and original handwriting samples from the Ramseys. Judge Carnes said, all 6 experts agreed that Mr. Ramsey could be eliminated as the author of the ransom note. none of the 6 consulted experts identified Mrs. Ramsey as the author of the ransom note. Rather, the experts' consensus was that she probably did not write the ransom note. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being elimination as the author of the ransom note, the experts placed Mrs. Ramsey at a 4.5 or a 4.0. However, it appears that Judge Carnes wasn't exactly correct in her assessment. The experts didn't reach a consensus that Patsy probably did not write the note. First of all, there was no consensus. The experts were consulted individually and independently. And secondly, the only expert to say Patsy probably did not write the note was one of the experts hired by the Ramseys. At least one of the experts consulted by the Boulder police thought that Patsy may have written the note. Chet Abowski from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who was one of those experts, said, "This handwriting showed indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey, but the evidence falls short of that necessary to support a definite conclusion." Leonard Speckin, one of the other experts, said, "There was only an infinite chance that some random intruder would have handwriting characteristics so remarkably similar to those of a parent sleeping upstairs." So it seems that the experts couldn't rule Patsy out, but there weren't quite enough indicators for them to say she wrote it either. That does not translate to she probably did not write it, as Judge Carnes suggests. During the grand jury trial, 3 handwriting experts testified, including Chet Abowski. One of the jurors had this to say: "We heard from 3 handwriting experts, and even though the handwriting experts couldn't definitively say she wrote it, they all 3 came to the same conclusion that it could have been Patsy Ramsey, and the grand jury believed that she wrote it." Officer French was the first to arrive at the scene on the morning of December 26th. It was 5:55 a.m. and John let him inside. According to Officer French, Patsy told him that she went to wake Jonbenet at 5:45 a.m. but found her bed empty. Then she went downstairs where she found the ransom letter. But this is different to what Patsy said in her police interviews. She told detectives that she spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, then 5 to 10 minutes in the laundry room before going downstairs. She found the note, then ran upstairs to check Jonbenet's room. She screamed for John, either before or after she checked Jonbenet's room. But the Ramseys' first police interview didn't occur until 4 months later, in April 1997. So what they told Officer French that morning is probably closer to the truth, or at least their version of the truth. According to John, they had to convince Officer French that Jonbenet was kidnapped. He thought that she was probably in the house, hiding somewhere, but John showed him the ransom note, and eventually he notified the sergeant that it probably was a kidnapping. Officer French looked around the house and went down to the basement. He noticed that the wine cellar door was latched, so he didn't open it. French reported that within 15 minutes of his arrival, the Ramseys' friends had also arrived, but unfortunately, a lot more people entered the home, potentially contaminating and destroying evidence. These people included Reverend Roll from the Ramseys' church and a Boulder police victim advocate support group. Shortly after he arrived, Fleet White checked the house. He went down to the basement as well, looked around, and unlatched the door to the wine cellar. He glanced inside, but it was too dark and he couldn't find the light switch, so he shut the door and latched it. At some point between 7 and 9 a.m., John checked the house and went down to the basement. He said he saw the broken window with the Samsonite suitcase directly below it. He didn't think anything of it because he had broken that window in the summer in order to get into the house when he got locked out. But he noticed the suitcase was out of place and it shouldn't have been in that room. If it was so odd to him though, why didn't he mention it to anyone? Maybe John knew that the suitcase had no relevance. The idea that an intruder may have used the suitcase as a step to climb out of the window doesn't make much sense when there was a footstool and a chair in the same room. When asked why he never mentioned the broken window, John said they always left the window open a little because it got hot down there and he knew he had broken it, so didn't attribute it to anything odd. But it doesn't make sense to open a broken window. It's broken. There's already airflow. This next part is muddled with different stories from John, Patsy, and Burke. At about 7 that morning, John woke up Burke and told him that Jonbenet was missing. Apparently, Burke started crying as they hurried him out of the house. He scrambled to get a toy, and then Fleet White drove him to his house. John said they wanted to keep Burke safe and away from all of the commotion. But Burke's bedroom was on the same floor as Jonbenet's, so why didn't they ask him questions before they sent him away? Maybe he heard something. In Burke's police interview, he said that he woke up from the commotion in the house, but didn't go downstairs. He figured someone would come get him if it was important. He said he was awake, but John said he woke him up. But Burke could have just been lying there with his eyes closed, and to John that may have looked like he was asleep. But in Burke's Dr. Phil interview 20 years after the murder, he said that Patsy came into his room that morning. He said, "The first thing I remember is my mom bursting into my room, really frantic, saying things like, 'Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh,' running around my room looking for Jonbenet. At that point, I was awake." Patsy said that before she called 911, she checked Jonbenet's room, and John checked on Burke, and he was sleeping. So, did she wake up Burke or not? Some people think that they can hear Burke's voice in the background of the 911 call. Back to the morning of the 26th, other Boulder police officers arrived to fingerprint and photograph the house. There are a couple of discrepancies in Officer French's report compared to what John and Patsy said in their police interviews. Officer French reported that the Ramseys said they arrived home the night before at 10 p.m, but in their interviews they said they arrived home between 9 and 9:15 p.m. Additionally, John told Officer French that he read to both Burke and Jonbenet for a little bit before going to sleep himself at 10:30. The Ramseys have repeatedly said since their first police interview that Jonbenet was completely asleep and didn't wake up once they got home from the Whites. She had fallen asleep in the car. Both John and Patsy have always said that Jonbenet never woke up again. If this is the case, then why would John have read to Jonbenet that night? But since he told Officer French he did this, it seems this is closer to the truth, or again their version of it. So maybe Jonbenet was awake after all, and if she was, well, that changes everything. If she was awake, then that leaves the Ramseys open to scrutiny. By maintaining she was asleep the whole time, it's safer for them. They can deny every accusation and just say it's not possible because she was sleeping. At 8:10 a.m, detectives Linda Arndt and Fred Patterson arrived. Linda Arndt wrote a lengthy police report of her account of the morning of December 26th. In it, she details how police had set up phone taps so when the kidnapper called, they could trace and record the call. She and John discussed what he should say when the kidnapper rang. She told him that he must demand to speak to Jonbenet, that he must request the kidnapper give him more time to acquire the money. John spent most of the morning in the den waiting for the call, though according to Linda Arndt, there were 3 occasions when John was not in the den when the phone rang and he ran back in to answer it. She also noted that there was one occasion where John left the house to retrieve the mail, and she found him opening some in the kitchen. He apparently spent a lot of time pacing between the den where the phone was and the dining room. Linda noted that Patsy spoke softly, had a vacant stare, and often stared off into the distance. She seemed dazed. Patsy was comforted by her friends, but she and John didn't interact. While many people that day described Patsy as being distraught, John had been described as more distant. But some people are less outwardly emotional, and people that knew John personally have said that he didn't often show his feelings. John said that he went up to Burke's room that morning and used binoculars to scan the neighbourhood. He said that when his daughter Beth died, there was nothing he could do. But when he thought Jonbenet was missing, he put all of his energy into thinking logically about how he could get her back. Linda Arndt also reported that at one point John was on the phone to someone and she could see him crying. Since the family was supposed to fly out to their lake house that morning, John called the charter company and told them of the situation. He wanted them to get in touch with Melinda and John Andrew, which they did, and they got a flight to Colorado, arriving at the Ramseys' house later that day. Here are some other events that happened that morning. Patsy told Linda Arndt that the housekeeper had said to Patsy's mother many times, "Jonbenet is so beautiful, aren't you afraid someone will kidnap her?" Patsy told Linda Arndt that the housekeeper also had a key to the house, and she was one of the first people the Ramseys suspected of taking Jonbenet. John Fernie, one of the Ramseys' friends who was at the house, had a friend who was manager of a bank in Boulder. He called him and arranged for $118,000 in cash to be made available, which would be charged to John Ramsey's visa. John Fernie went and got the cash, but police told him he wasn't allowed to bring it back to the Ramsey house. Linda Arndt requested writing samples from John and Patsy, which John gave her. She asked him if anything unusual stood out to him about the ransom letter, but according to her, John said very little. Between 9 and 9:45 a.m., Detective Sergeant Robert Whitson informed Linda Arndt that the FBI had been notified. The ransom letter said that the kidnapper would call between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow. When 10 a.m. came and went, John said there was a discussion at the house about whether the kidnapper meant the 26th or the 27th. At some point, he said in his 1997 police interview that they thought, okay, maybe we're not getting a call today. Despite this, he was still hovering around the den waiting for the phone to ring. And it did ring, about 5 or 6 times between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. Every time it rang, John rushed to answer it, and the police got their recording devices ready, but every time it was a false alarm. However, in a 1999 ABC News interview, Linda Arndt had a different story. She said 10 o'clock comes and goes, and there's no acknowledgement in the house from anyone that the deadline imposed by the author of the ransom note has come and gone. At around 10:30 a.m., Jonbenet's bedroom was sealed off with police tape so no one could enter. Around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt noticed that John was just sitting with his thoughts, waiting. So she suggested that he and Fleet White search the house again for any clues and see if anything was missing. She told him to search it top to bottom. This is a big mistake. It is the police's job to search the house, and had they done that, they might have found Jonbenet much earlier and been able to preserve any crucial evidence. Unfortunately, what happened next is sloppy police work. John, in his first police interview, said that he wanted to check every inch of the house from top to bottom, and could have easily started on the 3rd floor, but he started from the basement. And top to bottom is just a saying, it doesn't literally mean from the top to the bottom. He and Fleet went down to the basement first, and John pointed out the broken window. He said for 30 seconds or so, he and Fleet looked around on the floor to check for shards of glass. And they actually found one. There was a shard of glass on the suitcase itself. Then John went through the boiler room and then unlatched and opened the door to the wine cellar. John said as soon as he opened the door, he saw the white blanket and just knew that he had found her. He doesn't remember if he turned on the light or not, but he does remark that the door was latched when it wasn't usually. He said he wasn't expecting the door to be latched. He said the door was stiff, so there was no reason to latch it, so they usually didn't. This is interesting because we know that Officer French was the first person to check this door that day, and he found it latched, so he didn't open it. So whoever went into the wine cellar before Officer French latched the door, and this person was probably the killer based on the timing. If John killed Jonbenet and put her in the wine cellar, why would he latch the door and then say he expected it to be unlatched? Or was he purposely trying to confuse everyone with his observations? If John is being truthful, then it means that someone else latched the door after putting Jonbenet in there. When John saw Jonbenet in the wine cellar, she was lying on her back with her arms raised and her wrists tied. She had black duct tape across her mouth, which John removed. He also tried to untie the cord tying her wrists, and managed to untie most of it. He noted that she was lying on the white blanket and it was folded over her legs as if someone had tucked her in. Linda Arndt said she saw Fleet pick up the phone in the den, dial 3 numbers, then hang up. He then shouted for someone to call 911. Meanwhile, John carried Jonbenet up the stairs, and Linda Arndt directed him to place Jonbenet on the floor, and so he did. She noted that rigor mortis was present, and John asked her if she was dead, to which Linda said she was. Barbara Fernie, Patsy's friend, didn't want Patsy to see what was going on, so she held her back. Linda told John to call 911, and while he was supposedly doing that, she moved Jonbenet to the living room. At 1:12 p.m, there was still no officer response or ambulance en route, so she called 911 herself from a cell phone she found in the kitchen. She told the operator that there was a code black, the code for murder. Linda told John that he could say goodbye to Jonbenet, but he wasn't allowed to touch her hands or move her. So John laid on top of her and hugged her. Then Patsy did the same thing. Linda Arndt said John made crying noises and was looking around, but she didn't see any tears. Whether John was fake crying or not, Linda Arndt should not have allowed them to touch Jonbenet and potentially contaminate any evidence. Regardless, John may have contaminated evidence anyway when he grabbed a blanket and threw it over Jonbenet without Linda's permission. Patsy then got on her knees. She cried out, "Jesus, you raised Lazarus from the dead. Raise my baby from the dead." Unfortunately, it was only after Jonbenet was discovered that the police started treating the house like a crime scene. But Linda Arndt said that it was difficult to control the house because there were so many people there. And for long periods of time, including when Jonbenet was found, Linda Arndt was the only officer there. The forensics team and other detectives had come and gone by that point, but they returned to the house when Jonbenet's body was discovered. Around 1:40 p.m, Detective Bill Palmer overheard John on the phone making arrangements to fly to Atlanta. Apparently, he was on the phone to his pilot. This seemed sketchy, as if John wanted to escape immediately. But according to John, Lockheed Martin rang him and told him that they will send a plane to take him and his family to Atlanta. John said he never told them what was going on, so someone else must have. But he said that Atlanta was home, and when Beth died, they went to Atlanta. It was their instinct to go there. He said he didn't ask for the plane, but they offered it to him, so perhaps this was what he was arranging. But as it turned out, they did not fly to Atlanta that day because police instructed them not to leave Boulder, so that night they stayed at the Fernie's house. At 2:17 p.m, Detective Fred Patterson sat down with Burke to interview him. In the room was Priscilla White's sister. It's not clear if Burke knew that Jonbenet had been found, but we'll talk about his interviews later. At 2:35 p.m, detectives cleared the house and made everyone leave. At 8:20 p.m, Dr. John Meyer, the coroner, arrived and examined Jonbenet's body. Since there wasn't a pool of Jonbenet's blood in the house, we don't know exactly where she was killed. But her murder was brutal, and it's easy to forget the severity of her injuries simply because there wasn't any blood. The following is from the autopsy report. A white cord was tied around Jonbenet's right wrist. The same or similar white cord was tied around her neck, and the ends of the cord were tied around a wooden paintbrush handle. She suffered a skull fracture measuring 8.5 inches in length. A red ink drawing of a heart was found on the palm of her left hand. Dr. John Meyer did not estimate a time of death, but concluded she died of asphyxia by strangulation associated with cranial cerebral head trauma. Jonbenet suffered hugely. The skull fracture alone signifies a violent and angry intent to harm her, and the use of a garrote to tighten the cord and strangle her also points to an angry and violent act. But what people can't agree on is whether the strangulation or the blow to the head came first. Was Jonbenet already dead when she was strangled? Dr. John Meyer, who performed the autopsy, noted that Jonbenet suffered a scalp hemorrhage, which he described as a fresh hemorrhage without organisation. A hemorrhage without organisation develops post-mortem, after death. If his findings are accurate, it could mean that Jonbenet was strangled first and then hit on the head, which ultimately killed her. But he also noted petechial hemorrhaging in Jonbenet's eyes. In other words, tiny blood vessels that burst. This is a strong indication of asphyxia and that she was alive when strangled. But it can also occur after death if the person is either lying face down or the face is in a position which is lower than the rest of the body. Dr. Lucy Rourke, a neuropathologist with the Philadelphia Children's Hospital who testified at the grand jury, supports this theory that the head blow came first. James Kohler, in his book Foreign Faction, summarized her testimony, saying, "She told investigators that the blow to the skull had immediately begun to hemorrhage, and it was not likely that she would have regained consciousness after receiving this injury. The blow to the head, if left untreated, would have been fatal. The presence of cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, suggested that Jonbenet had survived for some period of time after receiving the blow to her head." It's important to keep in mind that Dr. Rourke did not examine Jonbenet's body, but she did examine her brain tissue. But Dr. Rourke surmises that Jonbenet was strangled while face down due to the urine stains on the front of her underwear, and petechial hemorrhaging can occur after death if the person is lying face down. Why all of this matters is because Detective Lou Smith, who believes an intruder killed Jonbenet, theorized that the intruder strangled Jonbenet first in some type of sex act and then hit her on the head to kill her. Ultimately, though, we do not know which came first, but Dr. Meyer did say that he thought that they were so close together, the strangulation and the head blow, that he couldn't determine which one came first. In his opinion, they likely occurred simultaneously or very close one after the other. There is one head scratcher that comes up again and again in this case, and that's the pineapple. After Jonbenet had eaten dinner at the White's house on the 25th, she at some point ate fresh pineapple. It was found in her small intestine. Food passes through the stomach after about 1.5 to 2 hours, and can stay in the small intestine for up to 5 hours. But the pineapple was found in Jonbenet's duodenum, the part of the small intestine right next to the stomach. So experts in the case concluded that she ate the pineapple approximately 1.5 to 2 hours before her death. Figuring out when and where Jonbenet ate this pineapple is crucial to this case, because the Ramseys have continually stated that Jonbenet was asleep when they got home from the Whites. They did not wake her up, and they certainly didn't give her pineapple, they say. So either Jonbenet ate some without them knowing, or they're lying. Officer French, the first to arrive at the house, wrote in his report that John Ramsey said he had read to the kids before they went to sleep. If Officer French heard him correctly, then this proves that Jonbenet was awake, at least for a little while. But in John's first police interview, he said that he read for a few minutes in bed before turning off the light and going to sleep, and what the officer reported was a mistake. I did not check every door in the house the night before. I don't think I checked any door. I think I was tired, wanted to go to bed, get up early. I think the other part I noted in there was they said I read to both kids before I went to bed, and that did not happen. What happened was the kids went to bed, and then I read to myself in bed. John, let me ask you this. Do you attribute that to simply an officer's error in recollection, or might you have said that and... I wouldn't have said that. I think it might have been maybe the way I said it that was misinterpreted, but we clearly did not read to the kids that night. Jonbenet was asleep. We wanted Burke to get to sleep, so we could get them up early the next morning. But even if John is telling the truth here, and Jonbenet was asleep, she had to have woken at some point to eat the pineapple. The crime scene photographs taken on the 26th show a bowl of pineapple sitting in a white bowl with a large spoon on a table. The pineapple appears to be in milk. This pineapple was tested and compared with the pineapple found in Jonbenet's system, and they were consistent down to the rind. Both were determined to be fresh pineapple, not canned. But neither Patsy nor John know anything about the pineapple. They don't know how it got there in that bowl or how or why Jonbenet could have eaten any. Remember Patsy's favourite book, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie? One line in that book reads, "The speciality of the feast was pineapple cubes with cream." Perhaps this is where Patsy got the idea for this snack, because it is an odd combination and not one you'd find in many places, because pineapple has a low pH and will curdle milk or cream, making it taste bitter. But maybe Patsy read this in that book and had served this combination of food before. What's more, Patsy's fingerprints are on the bowl. Burke's fingerprints are also on the bowl, and his fingerprints are also on the glass containing a tea bag, which is next to the bowl. Patsy said they don't make tea like that with tea bags at their home. John said that Patsy and Burke both liked sweet iced tea. And sweet iced tea is a southern recipe, where you boil water on the stove, dissolve sugar in it, add and drain the tea, then let the mixture cool and store it in the fridge. The tea is then served in a glass with ice. You don't just make it with tea bags in a glass over ice. Much speculation is aimed at Burke then. Did he get himself a late night snack and attempt to make sweet iced tea? John says that he put Burke to bed, and that he and Patsy went to bed at 10:30. And Patsy said she sometimes heard Burke get up and use the bathroom at night, but she didn't hear anything that night. But in Burke's Dr. Phil interview, he says that he snuck downstairs. He said, "I remember being downstairs after everyone was kinda in bed and wanting to get this thing out. I just remember being downstairs. I remember this toy." So did Burke go downstairs after everyone was in bed? John even admits that he could tell Burke wouldn't want to go to bed after they got home from the Whites. In his 1997 interview, he said, "Oh, it was a little thing that kind of unfolded, and it was like a car ramp or something, and then it folded all back together and made something else." Was it like putting stickers on it? Well, it was a plastic thing they had to assemble, and he had some stickers too, and he was intent on getting it done before he went to bed. So did Burke fix himself a bowl of pineapple and milk? Did Jonbenet come downstairs too and eat some? When Burke is interviewed by police, he doesn't have much to say about the pineapple. When they showed him a picture of it, he didn't appear to know what it was. So where did it come from? Was it served at the children's Christmas party on the 23rd and Patsy just forgot? Was it put in the fridge and then Burke took it out of the fridge on the 25th? That would explain both his and Patsy's fingerprints on the bowl, but it doesn't explain the rogue tea bag. What's certain is that Jonbenet would not have sat with an intruder and eaten pineapple. John even says this in his police interview, that she would have screamed bloody murder if someone she didn't know was downstairs with her. One of the most popular theories to what happened to Jonbenet is that the Ramseys did it. It could have been both John and Patsy, or just one or the other. Did John kill her and Patsy helped cover it up? Did Patsy kill her and John has no idea? Let's look at some of the reasons why people think they are guilty. The first is the ransom letter. We have already gone over how Patsy could be the author of this letter, so we won't repeat it, but the letter came from Patsy's notepad, was written with her pen, and both were placed back in their original places. It doesn't prove she wrote the letter, but when you add similarities in language and handwriting, it is a compelling argument. John has been excluded as the author of the letter, but he still may have dictated the letter and Patsy wrote it. Patsy did claim she asked John what they should do when they found the ransom letter. He told her to call 911. This shows their dynamic. Patsy looked to John to solve the problems. He was the leader of the family. It's possible she asked him what to write. During Jonbenet's autopsy, Dr. Meyer found evidence, including dried blood, that sexual abuse had occurred the night she was killed. According to James Kohler, who by the way was lead investigator and had access to the full police file, wrote in his book Foreign Faction that Dr. Meyer discovered something else that was extremely concerning. Here's a passage from page 58. He said, Dr. Meyer also observed signs of chronic inflammation around the vaginal orifice and believed that these injuries had been inflicted in the days or weeks before the acute injury that was responsible for causing the bleeding at the time of her death. This irritation appeared consistent with prior sexual contact. If Dr. Meyer is correct, it means that somebody was essaying Jonbenet in the days or weeks leading up to her death. And Dr. Meyer sought a second opinion from Dr. Andy Sirontak, chief of Denver Children's Hospital Child Protection Team, who concurred with Dr. Meyer's assessment, but neither of them could determine when exactly or how many times this abuse occurred. The Boulder police had these findings reviewed by several highly regarded experts from around the country. The experts agreed that Jonbenet had sustained an injury to her hymen, which had healed prior to the 25th. Dr. Robert Kirshner said, the genital injuries indicate penetration and are evidence of molestation that night, as well as previous molestation. Although in agreement, the experts were unable to prove conclusively that her injuries were from prior SA. But we do know Jonbenet suffered SA on the night of her death. Dr. Meyer said that on the night she died, Jonbenet had received an injury consistent with digital penetration. After testing, it was found that she may have been penetrated with a paintbrush handle. Considering this evidence as well, the likelihood, therefore, that this penetration had occurred previously is high. Jonbenet's paediatrician, though, Dr. Buff, said he never saw any signs of SA. He said, I can tell you, as far as her medical history is concerned, there was never any hint whatsoever of SA. I didn't see any hint of emotional abuse or physical abuse. She was a very much loved child, just like her brother. However, it doesn't appear that he had ever thoroughly examined Jonbenet where she had sustained these injuries. The Ramseys have not outright acknowledged that Jonbenet was SA'd the night of her death, though in recent years John seems to have accepted it. However, the Ramseys have flat out denied that she may have been SA'd prior to her death.
I did not kill my daughter Jonbenet. There have also been innuendos that she has been or was sexually molested. I can tell you those were the most hurtful innuendos to us as a family. They are totally false.
It seems that the Ramseys are either in denial that someone, perhaps within the family, could have done something like that to Jonbenet, or they were the ones guilty of it. They have never wanted to get to the bottom of it, which comes across like they're protecting themselves, or someone else. The fibre evidence is difficult to verify due to the reports not being public. Patsy claimed that she wore a red Christmas sweater with her black velvet pants to the White's house, but the police were able to view a photo taken that night, and Patsy wasn't wearing a Christmas sweater. Over her red turtleneck, she wore a red, black and grey checkered jacket. When Jonbenet was found, she had black duct tape over her mouth, which John said he removed. The tape had several fibres stuck to it. The fibres that have received the most attention were the red fibres that were determined to be microscopically and chemically consistent with 4 fibres from a piece of clothing that Patsy Ramsey was wearing. James Kohler states in Foreign Faction, Detective Trujillo advised me that lab technicians had identified 8 different types of fibres on the sticky side of the duct tape that covered Jonbenet's mouth. They included red acrylic, grey acrylic, and red polyester fibres that were microscopically and chemically consistent to each other, as well as to fibres taken from Patsy Ramsey's Essentials jacket. Further, fibres from this jacket were also matched to trace fibres collected from the wrist ligature, neck ligature, and vacuumed evidence from the paint tray and wine cellar floor. How did those fibres get on the wine cellar floor if Patsy wasn't in there? It's not a room that was commonly used, and the door was always kept shut. The garrote used to strangle Jonbenet was fashioned from a paintbrush that belonged to Patsy. It would have come from the paint tray where more fibres were found. If Patsy killed Jonbenet, then it must have happened fairly quickly after they arrived home, since Patsy hadn't taken off her jacket. Patsy claimed that fibres could have transferred when she hugged Jonbenet's body after she was found, only she wasn't wearing her jacket that morning. She was just wearing the turtleneck. So how did her jacket fibres get all over key areas the killer would have touched? But the problem is, only the red fibres matched Patsy's jacket, and we do not know the origin of the other fibres found. What's more, only red fibres were found on the garrote and blanket. There weren't any black ones. So that would mean that Patsy's jacket only shed red fibres over these key places. And what are the chances of that? Why didn't the jacket shed the black and grey fibres too? As for some of the other fibres found, James Kohler said, brown cotton fibres had been found on 4 items associated with the body of Jonbenet and the instruments used in her murder. Lab technicians thought the fibres similar to a pair of cotton work gloves. But the Ramseys didn't have such gloves. They also found blue fibres, thought to be from a cloth on Jonbenet's genitals. It's thought that someone had wiped her, but this cloth has not been found. Red fibres from Patsy's jacket were also found on the white blanket that Jonbenet was wrapped in. Police asked Patsy about this blanket, and she said that it would go on Jonbenet's bed between the comforter and the top sheet. How was her blanket on her bed? Normally it was made and it would be the fitted sheet, and there was usually a top sheet, kind of a bed sheet, you know. There was a top sheet and then there was her blanket, this cotton blanket, and that would have been, you know, all that stuff tucked in under the bed, and then this is a comforter that just lays on top. But Patsy did not remember if the white blanket was on the bed when she put Jonbenet to bed on the 25th. If an intruder killed Jonbenet, then we could argue that the white blanket was on the bed that night as usual, and fibres were transferred from Patsy's jacket to the white blanket when she put Jonbenet to bed that night. The intruder would have had to pull the white blanket from between the comforter and the top sheet, but we can't tell from looking at Jonbenet's bed whether they did this. But if the blanket wasn't on the bed that night, then how could Patsy's jacket fibres have transferred to it? The housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, was shown this photo of Jonbenet's bed. She said that in order to remove the white blanket, you first had to remove the comforter, otherwise the bed would get messed up. But the comforter looks neat on the end of the bed, so to her it didn't look like the comforter had been removed. But we know that the white blanket wasn't on the bed. She was also shown a picture of the washer and dryer outside Jonbenet's bedroom. Inside the dryer were white and pink checkered sheets, which she says she put on Jonbenet's bed 2 days before the murder. In the crime scene photo, we can see that Jonbenet's bed has Beauty and the Beast sheets on it. Linda thought that Jonbenet must have wet the bed in the 2 days prior to the murder, and Patsy changed the sheets, putting the wet sheets and the white blanket in the washer and dryer outside Jonbenet's room. Linda said that this washer and dryer was only used for Jonbenet's wet sheets, and it was built into a cabinet, so walking past you wouldn't know they were there. The family's clothes were usually washed in the basement. She said that only someone who knew that washer and dryer was for Jonbenet's sheets would have known the white blanket was in there. So would an intruder have taken the white blanket from this dryer? It doesn't seem likely. But we don't know for sure if the blanket was in there. It may have been on the bed, and the intruder removed it without messing up the comforter. But according to the housekeeper, the bed sheets were changed, meaning the white blanket had to have been in the washer and dryer with the other sheets. While the red fibres do seem like a match to Patsy's outfit, the fibre evidence is not conclusive that Patsy was involved because, for one, Patsy lived in the house and fibres can be easily transferred, and two, we know the house wasn't immediately treated as a crime scene. Several people, including 5 people the Ramseys knew personally, were coming and going from the house that morning. Evidence could have been contaminated. There's also the question of where did the other fibres come from, and why did only the red fibres from Patsy's jacket match? But alleged fibres from Patsy weren't the only fibres found. In John Ramsey's 2000 police interview, detectives tell John that black fibres from the shirt he was wearing the night of the 25th was found in Jonbenet's underwear. If true, this is damning. But his shirt was not entered into evidence until March 1998, 15 months after the murder. And when John and his lawyer asked to see the report, they were never shown one. They said they doubted a report even existed, and that it was probably an interrogation tactic used by police to try to get John to confess. However, we can see on Dr. Henry Lee's notes about the fibre evidence that black wool fibres were found when they swabbed Jonbenet's genitals. So maybe the police were not lying, and John's shirt fibres really were a match. Unfortunately, in 2023, a federal judge found Dr. Henry Lee liable for fabricating evidence in a murder trial that sent 2 innocent men to prison. In 1985, Dr. Lee said there were blood stains found on a towel in the victim's home, but when the men appealed their convictions, it was discovered that the stain was not blood. It looks like Dr. Lee hadn't even done any testing. Dr. Henry Lee has denied fabricating evidence, but it now begs the question, can we trust him to do accurate testing? Investigators did not just find fibres on the white blanket though, they also found hairs. One was a long head hair, and the other was initially thought to be a pubic hair. Colorado Bureau of Investigation, who performed the testing on the hairs, listed them as CMO4 pubic hair from white blanket, CMO5 head hair from white blanket. But years later, it appears that the pubic hair was something else. James Kohler writes in Foreign Faction, one particular sample of hair collected from the blanket that had been wrapped around Jonbenet's body and had initially given the appearance of being a pubic hair, investigators thought this might belong to a male perpetrator. The FBI was later able to identify this as an axillary hair, underarm, back, or chest, and determined it did not come from the pubic region of the body. Mitochondrial DNA tests were run on this hair, and the FBI technicians determined that the hair shaft did not belong to an identified stranger. Patsy Ramsey could not be excluded as the source of the hair, and it was noted that it could have come from either her or someone else in her maternal lineage. But the hair wasn't a full match to Patsy, and it's unlikely she would have long curly hairs on her back, chest, or underarms. Anyone in her maternal line could have shed that hair at some point, and it was transferred to the blanket. As for the head hair, it's also unidentified. One interesting hair found was an animal hair, discovered on the duct tape. It was determined to be beaver hair. Patsy owned some fur clothes, but unfortunately none of them were tested, so we don't know if they matched. Regarding the lack of testing, the Ramseys never handed over the garments voluntarily, and Detective Steve Thomas said, "Too bad there wasn't a DA who would approve warrants and subpoenas for Patsy's fur garments, coats, boots, etc. That way we could have done comparison analyses and determined if Patsy had anything that matched or was consistent." Neighbour Melody Stanton reported hearing a scream between midnight and 2 a.m. She described it as a child's scream that lasted 3 to 5 seconds, but she also told police it may not have been an audible scream, but rather the negative energy radiating from Jonbenet, whatever that means. Whether this scream actually happened or not, we'll never know because no other neighbour heard a scream, but if it did happen, then it's pretty damning for the Ramseys because they would have heard it, yet they say they heard nothing. Jonbenet was found with a red heart drawn on her palm. John said that he didn't think it was something Jonbenet would do, and he never saw her with it. Police questioned Patsy about it as well, and she said she didn't notice it when she put Jonbenet to bed on the 25th. How about did she have any marks from markers or anything like that? I didn't notice anything that night when she went to bed, and I know there was a red heart on her hand or her forehead. I don't know when that, I didn't inspect her when I put her to bed. Would she have washed her hands at a particular time? Well, at dinner, she rarely washed her hands. At the Whites, did somebody say, "Oh, here, get ready for dinner"? Did somebody tell her to go wash her hands at the Whites? Do you remember anything about that? I don't know. How was she about washing her hands? Just a typical kid, if she can get by with it, she wouldn't do it. But then she says something that might be a slip-up. The detective asks, "How did you know there was a heart on her hand?" Patsy said, "Because it was on there in the morning, that's why." "And you remember it from the next morning?" "Uh-huh." The next morning, on the 26th, Patsy found the ransom letter and Jonbenet was missing. So did Patsy mistakenly tell the truth here that she saw Jonbenet the next morning? Later in the interview, Patsy changed her story and said she wasn't sure if she actually saw the heart on Jonbenet or if she was just remembering it from the autopsy. A popular theory is that Patsy killed Jonbenet in retaliation for wetting the bed. Jonbenet was fully toilet trained at age 3, but after Patsy's cancer diagnosis, she started wetting the bed again. The housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, started working for the Ramseys in September 1995. She said that Jonbenet wet the bed every night for the first 6 months that she started working for them, but then she stopped. But then she started again, weeks before her death. What could have caused Jonbenet to regress again? Could it have been SA? We know that experts believe that Jonbenet suffered internal vaginal trauma, so it's possible that someone had started touching Jonbenet inappropriately in the months leading up to her death. Expert Dr. Richard Krugman, who was consulted regarding prior SA, agreed with the assessment that the healed internal injury existed, but claimed the injury could have been from physical abuse, not necessarily with a sexual motive. He said the Jonbenet case is a textbook example of toileting abuse rage. But both Patsy and John claimed that they didn't see the bedwetting as a big deal. It was something that all of their children did. And Patsy couldn't have been too concerned with constant wet sheets because she said in her 1997 police interview that she thought it might be better if Jonbenet felt wet, and if Jonbenet was wet, then so were the sheets. She said, "I've had her in pull-ups until very recently. I kind of thought it might be better. I mean, pull-ups and those pamper things are so absorbent that you can't, the child can't feel if they're wet or not. So I thought, well, it might just be better if she felt wet than being..." Linda Hoffman, their housekeeper, corroborated this and said, in the summer of '96, Jonbenet started wearing those diaper-type underpants, pull-ups. She even wore them to bed. There was always a wet one in the trash. By the end of the summer, Patsy was trying to get her to do without them. Then Jonbenet started wetting the bed again. Almost every day I was there was a wet bed. Patsy said she wasn't going to use pull-ups again. She just put a plastic cover on the bed. No big deal to her. By the time I'd come in the morning, Patsy would have all the sheets off in the bed and in the laundry. Jonbenet's white blanket would already be in the dryer. However, Linda Hoffman made some concerning comments regarding the bedwetting. She planned to write a book about the case, but only wrote one chapter, and it was never published. In it, she details how she thinks Patsy killed Jonbenet. She wrote, "Jonbenet wet the bed again that night, didn't she? She woke up and told you about it before you were even undressed, and you simply lost it. You took her into the bathroom. It was the same destination you always took Jonbenet when it was time to punish her for her bedwetting. You forgot that I saw you take her there so many times before, shutting the door tightly behind you, so her screams could not be heard. Except this time there was an accident, wasn't there? You picked up the long black flashlight you had brought with you, and you swung it. You swung it first at her crotch, and then next at her head. Maybe you meant to scare her, and maybe you didn't mean to kill her, but you did." The writing is quite sensationalist, and we have no way of verifying her claims. And she does contradict herself too, by first saying that Patsy would put plastic sheets on the bed and it was no big deal to her, but then later says Patsy got so angry with Jonbenet for wetting the bed that she killed her. That doesn't quite add up. And Linda already said herself that in the morning she would arrive at the house and Patsy would have already stripped the bed and put the sheets in the laundry. Patsy could have just left the job to Linda if she really hated the bedwetting situation, but she didn't. She dealt with it herself. That suggests that the bedwetting wasn't much of an issue for Patsy. And Burke also says the bedwetting wasn't a big issue. Did it concern your mum and dad that she did this? I don't think it did. Why not? Well, actually it sort of did, I forget. What would happen when Jonbenet would wet her bed? What would Mum or Dad do? Mum would change the sheets and all that stuff, and Dad wouldn't really do anything. He had to go to work in the morning. Would they ever talk to her about that? No, they did a little bit, just like saying you need to learn. How would they help her to learn to do that, do you know? I don't know. Was that a real problem for Jonbenet, bedwetting? Not a real big one. Okay, it was a noticeable one though. The Ramseys had spent the night of the 25th at the Whites' house. Early the next morning, after Patsy called 911, she called the Whites and the Fernies and hurried them over. Why did she do this? To cocoon herself away from police's questions? Or was it just moral support? Initially, supporters of the Ramseys, the Whites immediately felt something was off when the Ramseys took advice from their lawyer friend, Mike Bynum. While Fleet happily spoke to the police in the days following the murder, the Ramseys did not. Bynum then requested Fleet meet with attorneys from the law firm Haddon, Morgan and Foreman, as well as a private investigator. It seemed to Fleet that Team Ramsey was immediately trying to gauge what Fleet knew and what he had told the police. The situation continued to get worse when Fleet heard speculation on the radio that John's oldest son, John Andrew, was involved in the murder. He called police outraged and wanted them to set the record straight with a press release stating that John Andrew wasn't in Colorado at the time of the murder. Following this, Fleet said he received an angry phone call from one of John Ramsey's lawyers telling him not to interfere. It's a bit weird, considering he was only trying to protect John Ramsey's son. But things really came to a head during Jonbenet's funeral in Atlanta. Her funeral was held on December 31st, and the Whites attended. They were going to be staying with John's friend, Bob Westmoreland, one of the so-called Atlanta Fat Cats. Priscilla described him and John's friends as pretentious, being more concerned about the wine glasses than the tragedy of Jonbenet's death. Allegedly, there was a heated conversation with Bob Westmoreland, who told the Whites to back off. After that, the Whites found John and told him he needed to go back to Boulder and speak to police. On New Year's Day, the Whites learned that John and Patsy were going to be interviewed on CNN, and Fleet was dismayed. How could they do a TV interview but not talk to the police? It seemed that the Ramseys were more concerned with their image than the investigation. But John claimed that Fleet insisted he do the CNN interview. He said, "Well, I think I decided to do it, and Bob Westmoreland, who is a friend of the president of CNN, he was around us all that time too, Bob was, and he said, well, I can call whoever it was, and so the president of CNN kind of set up the interview, but it was at Fleet's insistence. I think in my mind we had gotten a lot of letters and sympathy cards and just wonderful outpouring of support, and I wanted to thank people, and this pressure that we were getting from Fleet and Priscilla just to speak up for ourselves and defend ourselves, and that, as I remember, it was Fleet's pounding on that." But Fleet denies this and said he only wanted the Ramseys to speak to the police. Despite assuring Fleet that they would speak to the police, the Ramseys didn't have their first interview until April 1997, 4 months after the murder. But the relationship between the Ramseys and the Whites really soured when John and Patsy alluded to Fleet and Priscilla being involved in Jonbenet's murder. John said Priscilla was very jealous of Patsy and said they had a hatred for wealth. When asked by police about his thoughts on the ransom letter, John said it was unusual that the writer used his name John a lot. He said that Fleet used his name a lot. "Fleet uses your name a lot, John this, and that's unusual, and that was my only impression. I didn't think a whole lot. Fleet and Priscilla we thought were our closest friends, so that's a bizarre thought, but it was a thought." Jonbenet was found to have abrasions on her skin that have been speculated to be from a stun gun. John told police that he thought Priscilla White was the type of person who might own one. He said, "It sounded like something that a woman may have in her purse for personal protection, and the people we knew, Priscilla being from California and kind of probably more, she came from an area where you have security issues and so forth, might have, if anybody was going to have one, it might be somebody like her." Regarding Fleet's character, John painted him as dangerous, erratic. He told police, "But Fleet was, and some of this is in retrospect, but apparently John Fernie wouldn't let him get on the plane. He was going to while he was flying back to Atlanta, and John Fernie wouldn't let him get on the plane. We were told because he was just crazy." After the Whites left Ron Westmoreland's house in Atlanta, John said, "They went and stayed at my brother's, and my brother called me and said that he had a gun in the house, and he said Fleet White just left and he's on his way over. I think he's extremely dangerous." John also told police that they didn't have black duct tape in the house, but Fleet might have. Fleet White spoke his mind and wasn't afraid to tell the world what he thought about the Ramseys and their close connections with powerful people. In the summer of 1998, lead detective Steve Thomas abruptly quit the Boulder police force, blaming District Attorney Alex Hunter, saying he had effectively crippled this case. After this, Fleet White wrote a 5,000-word open letter to the people of Colorado. In it, he scrutinizes Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter and the immediate support that was given to the Ramseys. When your best friend doesn't have your back, it doesn't look good for you. In 1999, 12 jurors reviewed the entirety of the evidence in the case in a grand jury trial. It was up to them to decide if anyone would be criminally indicted for the death of Jonbenet. A lot of the evidence that they saw has never been released to the public. A grand jury only needs probable cause to indict. It is not the same as proof beyond reasonable doubt. In a grand jury, usually only the prosecutor's evidence is heard, and the jury decides if there is enough evidence to try the suspect in a criminal court. Interestingly, the grand jury in this case also heard evidence from the defense, but still found probable cause to indict the Ramseys. They decided that John and Patsy should be indicted for unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permitted a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health resulting in her death. They also said the Ramseys did render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent discovery, detection, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted has committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. In other words, they thought the Ramseys knowingly placed Jonbenet in danger and helped protect the murderer. But controversially, District Attorney Alex Hunter disagreed with the jury and did not indict the Ramseys. While the DA has the right not to proceed, Alex Hunter wasn't transparent with his decision, leading the public to believe that the grand jury decided not to indict. When the indictments were revealed to the public years later, we finally got to see the truth. The DA said he didn't think the case could be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and so he decided not to try the Ramseys. And one of the jurors agreed with his decision. He was reported as saying, "There is no way that I would have been able to say beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the person. And if you are the district attorney, if you know that going in, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars to do it." However, we know that the district attorney was accused of being chummy with the Ramseys and their defense attorneys right away. He also delayed the grand jury trial, leading many people to speculate that the grand jury was just for show and Alex Hunter never intended to prosecute the Ramseys. Fleet White laid it all out in his open letter. He said, "After Jonbenet Ramsey was killed in Boulder nearly 20 months ago, her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, immediately hired prominent Democrat criminal defense attorneys with the law firm of Haddon, Morgan, and Foreman. This firm and its partners have close professional, political, and personal ties to prosecutors, the Denver and Boulder legal and judicial communities, state legislators, and high-ranking members of Colorado government, including Governor Roy Romer. The investigation of her death has since been characterized by confusion and delays. The district attorney and Ramsey's defense attorneys started early in the investigation to condition the public to believe that these delays and the lack of a prosecution have resulted almost entirely from initial police bungling of the case and the non-cooperation of witnesses. While it is unlikely that the district attorney has been corrupted by Ramsey defense attorneys, it is certain that the district attorney and his prosecutors have been greatly influenced by their metro area district attorney advisors and by defense attorneys' chummy persuasiveness and threats of reprisals for anyone daring to jeopardize the civil rights of their victim clients. In other words, Fleet criticized the DA and the prosecutors for being influenced by the Ramseys' attorneys and the alleged threats made if the Ramseys were indicted. He continued, "Indeed, the district attorney and the Ramsey attorneys have simultaneously rebuked the police for focusing the investigation on the Ramseys, when in fact police were simply following evidence." One of the main reasons that people theorize that Jonbenet's 9-year-old brother Burke is responsible for her death is the result of the grand jury. The jury effectively said that John and Patsy covered up the crime and protected the murderer, but who could they be protecting? Burke is certainly a strong contender because he was their son. A 9-year-old would not have been prosecuted, but the Ramseys probably wouldn't want the world to know that their son essayed and murdered his sister, so it's reasonable to believe that they would cover it up to protect their image. But what evidence is there against Burke? There isn't anything conclusive to prove he did it, but speculation that he may have been inappropriately touching Jonbenet, been jealous of her and violent towards her. CBS made a documentary that focuses heavily on Burke Ramsey. He sued them, but you can still find it online. In his Dr. Phil interview, Burke admits that he went downstairs after everyone had gone to bed, and his fingerprints were on the bowl of pineapple. We know Jonbenet ate that pineapple shortly before death, so this doesn't look good for Burke. The main theory suggests that Burke went downstairs after his parents were in bed and fixed himself a snack of pineapple and milk. Jonbenet came downstairs and snatched a piece. Burke was angry and had built up resentment from the attention and favoritism that Jonbenet received, and hit her over the head with the flashlight or other object. Jonbenet was unconscious, and panicking, he dragged her to the basement where he essayed her and then made a garrote with the paintbrush and finished her off. Burke was a Cub Scout after all and knew how to tie various knots. When Patsy called 911 the next day, she stopped responding to the operator before hanging up. During the brief period of time, some people believe they can hear John, Patsy, and Burke's voices. Burke allegedly says, "What did you find?" The Ramseys decided to protect Burke, and Patsy wrote the ransom letter to make it look like an intruder killed Jonbenet. Then they summoned the Whites to take Burke to their house so police couldn't question him. Another theory is that Burke initially hit Jonbenet on the head, cracking her skull and rendering her unconscious, and either John or Patsy or both decided to fashion a garrote and strangled her to make it look like an intruder killed her. But is there any evidence to support these theories? The pineapple bowl found in the house had only Patsy and Burke's fingerprints on it. It's reasonable to suggest that Patsy gave Burke the bowl of pineapple, or he got it himself and Jonbenet ate some. But would this lead to Burke getting so angry he would hurt Jonbenet? Furthermore, he said his favourite snack was pudding or yogurt, so why wouldn't he just grab one of those instead of making a bowl of pineapple and milk? Burke had reportedly hit Jonbenet with a golf club before, but his parents claimed it was accidental and that she was in the way of his swing. But some more concerning behaviour, according to James Kohler in Foreign Faction, is that investigators found what appeared to be feces smeared on a box of candy that Jonbenet received for Christmas. But we don't know whose it was. James Kohler implies that Burke did this. He mentions another incident that occurred years earlier. I had reviewed an investigator's report that documented a 1997 interview with former Ramsey nanny housekeeper Geraldine Vodica, who stated that Burke had smeared feces on the walls of a bathroom during his mother's first bout with cancer. She told investigators that Nedra Rapport, Patsy's mother, who was visiting the house at the time, had directed her to clean up the mess. If this is true, it seems to be related to Burke's distress regarding Patsy's cancer and was an isolated incident. One could argue that it shows Burke is prone to this behaviour, but we don't even know if the candy box with the smears even existed, and if Burke was responsible. The housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, noted that Jonbenet had a grapefruit-sized ball of feces in her bed once, but this points to it belonging to Jonbenet, not Burke. There's no evidence to suggest that Burke put it there. But what about the abrasions found on Jonbenet's skin? These dark marks appeared in multiple places on Jonbenet, including her lower back, leg, and face. Some people believe them to be the result of a stun gun. This theory seemed to originate from Detective Lou Smith, who thought the air taser was used on Jonbenet. While the marks on Jonbenet's back somewhat line up with the taser, without checking the tissue under the skin, there would be no way to know if the marks were the result of a stun gun. Also, there was only a singular mark on Jonbenet's face, not two, which Lou Smith purported to be from the killer holding the stun gun at an angle. Other theories claim that the stun gun was held over the duct tape on her mouth, which caused the white adhesive to melt onto her skin and prevent the other mark from appearing. But some people are adamant that stun guns leave burn marks, not abrasions. The National Institute of Health describes an abrasion as a superficial wearing of the skin due to scraping, impact, or pressure. So would Dr. Meyer have described the marks as abrasions even if he thought they were burns? Well, one expert did. Lou Smith had forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Doberson review the marks on Jonbenet's body. He described them as abrasions, but also concluded that they were consistent with a stun gun. Air Taser were contacted by Lou Smith, and they provided him with an Air Taser 34000 to conduct the experiments. Doberson reached his conclusion by experimenting on pigs and found that the marks from the stun gun on the pig's skin were consistent with the marks on Jonbenet. He said, "My experiments and the observations that we made and all the work that's been done, I feel that I can testify to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that these are stun gun injuries." But Air Taser representative Stephen Tuttle refuted this. He said, "It defies the logic of what the weapon does. We have never seen those types of marks when you touch somebody with a stun gun. We are talking hundreds of people that have been touched with these devices. I can't replicate those marks." Further, the Boulder police rejected the theory that the marks were from a stun gun. But one article alleges that Air Taser does everything in its power to distance itself and its products from injuries and deaths. The article reads, Taser has defended its signature weapon by leveraging close ties with police and other professionals, court records show. It has spent millions of dollars commissioning research on its weapons, much of it backing the company's contention that its stun guns are blameless in deaths or injuries. It regularly hires medical and scientific experts who vouch for the safety of the electric shock devices in court or in published studies, and it cultivates ties with medical examiners, the professionals who decide decide whether or not a taser shock is to blame in a fatality. So Stephen Tuttle's remarks might just be a way for Air Taser to distance themselves from Jonbenet's death. What's more, stun gun or taser injuries can look different due to a number of variables like placement on the skin, length of time it's held against the skin, distance, etc. Some stun gun injuries look like this, while others look more similar to the marks on Jonbenet. But again, without examining the tissue, we can't conclude if the marks were from a stun gun. So if the marks weren't caused by a stun gun, then what could they be from? Some people suspect that Burke poked and prodded Jonbenet with toy train tracks. In the Ramseys' basement was a room where Burke kept his train tracks. He had a Lionel O-gauge model railroad track. Though it has 3 pins, it's apparently common for pins to fall out, which can occur simply from picking up the track without support and allowing it to bend. So it's possible that the middle pin had fallen out. But there's no evidence that a train track missing its middle prong was ever found in the house. Theorists suspect that Burke punctured Jonbenet with the train tracks. While the track marks may have looked like red dots initially, after death, abrasions can darken. Abrasions tend to darken and dry after death and can be confused with a burn by the inexperienced physician. In the dead, as the circulation of blood has ceased, there is no exudation of serum and therefore the surface gets dried up and becomes hard, acquiring the consistency of parchment and also appears brownish. The dried abrasion often appears to be a much more extensive injury than it was at the time of death. The train track that Burke had matched the width of the abrasions on Jonbenet's body slightly better than the stun gun, so it is possible they were train track marks that darkened after death. But we have to keep in mind that the pineapple in Jonbenet's system had left her stomach, so she ate it 1.5 to 2 hours before she died. So that means that if Burke was so angry at Jonbenet for snatching some of his pineapple, he didn't kill her right away. Perhaps he hit her over the head, spent 2 hours fashioning a garrote, took her to the basement and prodded her with train tracks, then strangled her. But it doesn't fit with what the coroner said. Dr. Meyer reported Jonbenet's cause of death to be asphyxia by strangulation associated with cranial cerebral trauma. He said, "They are as close as happening simultaneously as I've seen, enough so that I didn't know which happened first, and listed them together as that's the most accurate. But if the head blow and strangulation occurred simultaneously, then it had to have happened at least 1.5 hours after she took the pineapple. And that means that Burke couldn't have hit her immediately in an angry retaliation. But if there was some time between the head blow and the strangulation, then it could have happened that way." Other experts, including Dr. Lucy Rourke, disagreed with Dr. Meyer. She thought that there was a period of time between the head blow and the strangulation due to the swelling in the brain. She estimated a period of 45 minutes to 2 hours, just enough time for pineapple to move out of the stomach. A piece of evidence that could link Burke to the crime scene is his boots. A boot print was found in the wine cellar next to Jonbenet's body, and it was consistent with a pair that Burke owned. But he lived in that house, and that boot print could have been there long before Jonbenet was killed. Police also found a Swiss Army knife, either in the corner of the wine cellar or in the hallway outside the wine cellar. It's not clear. It's possible this knife was used to cut the duct tape or the nylon cord used on Jonbenet. According to the housekeeper, she was getting annoyed that Burke was whittling wood all over the house, so she hid his knife in a linen closet near Jonbenet's room. According to her, Patsy could have easily found it, but according to Burke, he actually owned 2 Swiss Army knives, so what if he still had access to the other one? Burke was interviewed the day that Jonbenet was discovered missing. He was interviewed at the White's house by Detective Fred Patterson just after Jonbenet's body had been found. It's unknown if Burke was aware of this. If ushering Burke out of the house was a ploy by the Ramseys to keep him away from police, it failed. Burke doesn't ask about Jonbenet, though we don't have access to the full interview, so he may have. He said he didn't hear any screams or arguing during the night. He said he didn't argue with Jonbenet the day before. The detective asks Burke what he did when they got home from the White's house, and Burke tells him that he got ready for bed and went to bed. He doesn't mention setting up a toy with his dad, and he doesn't say he snuck downstairs after everyone went to bed. Perhaps he forgot, and perhaps he didn't want to get into trouble, or perhaps he's hiding something. In Burke's 1998 interview, he said that early on the 26th, Patsy came rushing into his room looking upset. He didn't go downstairs to see what was going on, he just stayed in bed freaked out. but he could hear Patsy going psycho. He said he was really worried. He couldn't hear Patsy on the phone to 911. He said he was trying to think of what might have happened. Eerily, he said he then thought Jonbenet might be missing. Did it scare you? Yeah, I bet it did. What was going through your mind at the time? I was trying to think of what might have happened, so I thought maybe I'm wrong, or maybe my dad's wallet or something, credit cards, but then I thought it was a little overreacting for something getting stolen. So you thought it was something more then? Something more than a possession. So what went through your mind then? Then I thought maybe Jonbenet was missing, but that's not that likely. I mean, what are the chances of that happening? But he says he thought this because he heard Patsy say, "Where's my baby?" Burke said he was scared and thought he would stay in bed until his dad told him what to do. He said he heard John tell Patsy to calm down and that they should call the police. But Burke said he was worried about Jonbenet. What were some of your worries and your concerns? I was worried about how Jonbenet was and, worried if they would find her. And when he found out she was dead, he was really upset. When did you really find out that Jonbenet was dead? At the Fernie's house. And I thought Jonbenet was going to be there. I thought they had found her, so I came in, got excited, and almost relieved. And I saw everyone was sad inside, and my dad told me that Jonbenet was in heaven. What did you do? Started crying, like sobbing, and build up to a cry? Regarding the pineapple, the detective really pushes Burke to single out pineapple as a snack that he or Jonbenet might have. Burke mentions lots of fruit, including bananas, apples, and grapes, not just pineapple. He said his favourite snack was pudding or yogurt, and apparently Patsy wasn't too concerned about nutrition. She would give them cookies and leftover pizza. He admits that sometimes they would have fruit and says that pineapple was one they all liked. The next day, the detective shows Burke the photo of the bowl of pineapple.
Dining room, table.
Can you describe that to me?
Big bowl of something.
Okay.
Looks like glass with a tea bag in it.
Does that look like cereal inside there?
Wow.
Or does it look like
There's a little big one piece right there.
uh-huh.
Maybe like fruit with doors.
Either Burke thinks the picture is funny for some reason, or he's laughing nervously because he knows what it is. When he says "oh" and then laughs, it's as if he's realised what it is. But maybe he was looking at the tea bag in the glass. It is odd for a tea bag to be in a glass instead of a mug or teacup, so maybe he was laughing at this. It's not clear if Burke knows there's pineapple in the bowl, though he correctly guesses fruit. Some people think Burke is awkward in his interviews, but sibling deaths have a profound psychological effect on children. Burke's flat affect could be depression, and Jonbenet didn't die in a tragic accident. She was brutally murdered in his home. If Burke is innocent, he suffered a traumatic event, the effects of which are long-lasting. He probably wasn't living in a happy household either, with all the attention on the Ramseys and the stress it probably caused. 13 days after Jonbenet's death, a psychologist had Burke draw a picture of his family. He did, but he left out Jonbenet. Some people think this is concerning, but children also process and react to grief differently than adults. In the book Bereavement, Reactions, Consequences and Care, which you can find in the National Library of Medicine, it says that some children experiencing bereavement can seem glib and unemotional. Losses are so painful and frightening that many young children, able to endure strong emotions for only brief periods, alternately approach and avoid their feelings so as not to be overwhelmed. In dealing with children who have sustained a loss, it is important to be aware of the special nature of grieving in children, and not to expect that they will express their emotions like adults. According to a mother of one of Burke's classmates, shortly after the murder, Burke and his good friend Doug Stein were discussing Jonbenet's death, and according to her, it sounded impersonal. She said they were discussing whether Jonbenet was strangled. But grieving children often process death by trying to control it. Children may be observed playing games in which the death or funeral activities are reenacted in an effort to master the loss. So this discussion with Doug could have been Burke's way of exerting some control over the death. If he could figure out exactly what happened, he could process it and move on. Even grieving adults will ruminate over a loss, trying to gain a sense of what happened so they can have some control over it. The ransom letter was addressed to John, so one theory is that the killer was someone who hated John or wanted revenge. Jonbenet was found with duct tape on her mouth, but the roll of duct tape has never been found. It could mean several things. The intruder took it with him when he left, or someone in the Ramsey house discarded the roll somewhere, or there is no roll and the tape was removed from another object before being placed on Jonbenet's mouth. But if the tape was removed from another object, it probably wouldn't be very sticky anymore. If an intruder did it, they probably took the roll of tape with them when they left the house. The tape covering Jonbenet's mouth had several fibres on it, and other than the ones consistent to Patsy's jacket, we don't know where they came from, so it's possible that an intruder left those fibres, particularly the brown cotton fibres in the garrote, which may have come from a pair of gloves. One interesting item found in the Ramsey house that points to someone singling out John for some reason is an article in a magazine called Boulder Business Issue. The October 1995 issue of the magazine was found on John's desk in a folder, and the article in question was called People vs. Profits. The article was about the journal's Esprit winners, and John Ramsey was one of them. Someone had used a red marker to write no over the other winners' faces. Over John's face, they had drawn what looks like a flower made up of hearts. Jonbenet was found with a red heart drawn on her palm. It could just be a coincidence, though. John said he had never seen that article or magazine in his house before. He couldn't explain where it came from or who would have drawn on it. He said that neither Jonbenet nor Burke would have drawn on it, and he said that their handwriting wasn't good enough to match anyway. And he's right, the writing is too neat and small for a 5 or 6-year-old to have done it. And apparently, Burke had a lot of problems with his handwriting being messy. Could Patsy or Jonbenet would have written that? No. Are you sure? Absolutely. That is very strange. Well, the reason why it has come to our attention, Jonbenet, did you ever read or hear anything about her in the autopsy report? That she had a heart on her hand? I heard that just recently. And the heart was in red ink. I don't know what that means. You got any thoughts on that? My thoughts, after I thought about it, was she wouldn't have drawn on herself like that. Curiously, the detective then asked John about possible pictures of Jonbenet in the basement. Why would he ask this, unless they found pictures of Jonbenet in the basement? Could an intruder have taken them and had them with him? Also, another question, have you ever seen pictures of your daughter in the basement of your residence? At any time, you mean? At any point? Of our house? Is it possible they could be down there? Oh, pictures of her? Yeah, pictures of her. It's unlikely. We tend to keep all our photographs in a drawer in a particular study. We call the study. There were some small pictures that were down there that we just didn't have a place for, but would they have been pictures of her? Not of her, I wouldn't think. I only think there were a couple pictures down there of a flower pot or something that we didn't want in the house, so they just ended up in the basement. But I don't know of any pictures of her in the basement. It's definitely a curious line of questioning. It does seem to suggest that the police found photographs of Jonbenet in the basement. Could someone have brought them in with them? Or were they one of the Ramseys? And the magazine article is strange in the sense that it does seem to single out John for whatever reason, but that's all it really tells us. But the main big reason that some people think an intruder killed Jonbenet is the DNA. DNA was found under Jonbenet's fingernails, mixed with her blood in her underwear and on the waistband of the long johns that she was wearing. The DNA found mixed with her blood in her underwear is thought to be saliva, though some people dispute this. Jonbenet had saliva and mucus on her cheek, and it can be argued that when testing, this was the area that tested positive for the enzyme found in saliva. But 3 swabs were taken of item 14 titled Foreign Stain Swab, and there is no swab titled Blood. The autopsy report notes the saliva on her cheek. It says, on the right cheek is a pattern of dried saliva and mucus material. So if they knew Jonbenet already had saliva on her cheek, why did they take 3 swabs of it and test it? And there's no mention of the blood stain in the underwear being tested, so it's plausible that item 14 foreign stain swab was the blood spot that tested positive for saliva. Regardless, the sample was tested for DNA, and a partial profile was developed. A lab report dated May 27, 1999, showed that no foreign DNA was found anywhere else in the underwear besides the bloodstains. That means if someone working in the manufacturer factory coughed or sneezed on the underwear, then DNA would have been found in several other places as well, but it wasn't. It was only found mixed with the blood. And if it was saliva, then that would rule out touch DNA as well, unless the person in the factory had saliva on their fingers. The DNA found mixed with the blood was entered into CODIS, an FBI database, and given the code UM1, or Unknown Male 1, but there were no matches. But they did find that the DNA was from a male, likely white or Hispanic, and it could not be excluded as a match with DNA found on 2 places on Jonbenet's long johns. Forensic scientist Dr. Angela Williams, who performed the test, said, "Notably, the profile developed by the Denver PD and previously uploaded to the CODIS database as a forensic unknown profile, and the profiles developed from the exterior top right and left portions of the long johns were consistent. This gives more weight to the theory that this is from the perpetrator and not from manufacturing contamination." But the DNA report also tells us that the profile obtained from the left side interior of the long johns was a mixture of at least 3 people's DNA, including Jonbenet, and at least one of them was a male contributor. That means there were 2 other people's DNA there, at least one of them was male. On the exterior of the left side, they found a mixture of Jonbenet's DNA and the DNA of at least one other individual, but could not rule out Burke or Patsy as the contributors. On the right side interior, they found Jonbenet's DNA and the DNA of at least one other individual. On the right side exterior, they found Jonbenet's DNA and the DNA of at least 2 others, including an unknown male. John, Burke, and Patsy were excluded. So this tells us that most of the DNA found was Jonbenet's, but they were able to find the DNA of potentially 3 other people, with at least one of them being male. Much speculation centers around these other profiles belonging to the manufacturers of the long johns, but the DNA of one of these profiles appears to be consistent with the profile labeled UM1, the DNA found mixed with Jonbenet's blood in her underwear, or at least it can't be excluded. Jonbenet's DNA was found to be mixed with someone else's on the garrote and wrist ligatures. The other partial profile did not match any of the Ramseys, and it didn't match UM1 either. This could point to a second individual being involved in the crime, or it could be DNA from a random person who had touched this cord in the past. However, John said that he tried to undo the knots around Jonbenet's wrists, and yet his DNA was not present on the ligatures. That's quite significant. So whoever left their DNA on the ligatures possibly did more than just briefly touch the cord. So to sum up, it looks like there could be DNA from one male who touched both exterior sides of the long johns and left saliva in the underwear. We have another individual who possibly tied the garrote and wrist knots. We have at least one other person who touched the left interior side of the long johns. The report concludes that more than 2 people, excluding Jonbenet, contributed to the mixtures on both exterior sides of the waistband. The unknown profiles did not match the Ramseys, Fleet White, the housekeeper, or any known suspects, including Gary Oliva and Bill McReynolds, the family's Santa Claus. But let's look at Gary Oliva anyway, for those of you who haven't heard about him. Gary Oliva is a convicted pedophile who was living near the Ramseys at the time of Jonbenet's murder. Numerous media outlets report him as living as close as 13 houses away. A former friend of his, Michael Vale, was in frequent correspondence with Gary Oliva, and in a series of letters, he confessed to killing Jonbenet. Michael said, "When we were at school, Gary used to creep into homes, buildings, and classrooms and steal art supplies, paintbrushes, glue, paint, things like that. He was getting his mail 13 houses away from the Ramseys, and I think he broke into that home more than once. What was down in the basement room where Jonbenet was found? That's where Patsy kept all her art supplies. I never looked at that garrote until after 2016, and when I saw it, all the hairs on my arms stood up straight away, and goosebumps were all over my neck. I said to myself, holy crap, that's a paintbrush, and there's a knot on the f***ing string. When I look at some of Gary's art collages he did at high school, he was fascinated with knots, complicated knots. It blew my mind when I saw the knots, and when I saw the garrote, my heart just sank. In May 1991, Oliva was on probation for molesting a 7-year-old. He was arrested after attempting to strangle his mother with a telephone cord. He was sent to jail for a year and a half. Michael Vale said that around midnight on December 26, 1996, the night that Jonbenet's body was found, he received a phone call from Gary, where Gary said that he had hurt a little girl. Michael pressed him for more information, but Gary hung up. The next morning, Michael said he learned of Jonbenet's death, and he called the Boulder police to tell them about the phone call, but they never followed up with him. Eerily, Gary Oliva attended a vigil for Jonbenet, and on December 12, 2000, Gary was arrested for trespassing, and in his possession he had a stun gun, a photograph of Jonbenet, and a poem he wrote about her. He also had hundreds of photos of Jonbenet on his cell phone. 2 handwriting experts reviewed Gary Oliva's letters and compared them to the ransom note. While they said that words and letters line up so well, keep in mind that these experts were not consulted by police, but a private investigator. One interesting comparison is that Gary Oliva's O's appear similar to the O's written on the article that singled out John. They have pointed tops and look like ovals, but I'm no handwriting expert. But Gary Oliva's DNA did not match any of the profiles that were tested. He could just be a pedophile obsessed with Jonbenet and imagined a fantasy where he was involved. In his poem, Ode to Jonbenet, a line reads, "I love you, Jonbenet. It would be worth it to take the blame for you." This could suggest he didn't kill her, but for some reason is willing to say that he did and take the blame. One person that the Ramseys quickly pointed the finger at was their housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, because she had a key to the house and allegedly knew their schedule. Linda was supposed to work on the 24th for the Ramseys, but didn't. She said, "I was supposed to come back the next day, December 24th, and clean up. I called Patsy and I said I couldn't. I told her I had a fight with my sister and needed some money to pay the rent. I asked Patsy for a $2,000 loan. I told her I would pay it back, $50 each week. She didn't hesitate. Sure, said she'd leave it for me on the kitchen counter for my next regular visit on December 27th. When discussing who the murderer could have been, Linda said in a 1998 TV interview, "When I cleaned that house, I cleaned that basement many times and I didn't even know that room was there. It tells me somebody had to know that house." But Linda knew the house, and she knew that the wine cellar existed. There was a safe in the wine cellar, and Linda admitted that both she and members of her family had been in there shortly before the murder to retrieve the Christmas trees. Since she cleaned the Ramsey house, she may have seen John's payslips and the $118,000 bonus. Or her husband Mervyn could have. He was the Ramseys' handyman who did odd jobs for them occasionally. The ransom note was left where it would be seen. According to Patsy, the bottom of the spiral stairs is where Patsy and Linda usually left notes for one another. It doesn't seem like Linda liked Patsy very much, and it's unclear what she thought of Jonbenet, but in an interview she said she acted like a spoiled brat. The police searched the Pugh house on the 27th of December and found 3 rolls of black tape, a notepad that had come from the Ramsey house. They also found 3 black felt pens, a 2-foot piece of narrow nylon cord, and another length tied around a stick. Mervyn, Linda's husband, gave his fingerprints but did not provide a DNA sample. Linda's son-in-law Mike also helped bring the Christmas trees out of the wine cellar. He also gave fingerprints but no DNA sample. In his book, Jonbenet Inside the Murder Investigation, Detective Steve Thomas, who worked on the case, said, Mervyn Pugh, the husband, was visibly intoxicated when he was interviewed, and the detectives knew he had a few brushes with the law back in Michigan. "Is she missing or dead?" he asked. "How did she die? Was it natural, strangulation, or what?" The questions were awfully close to the truth, close enough to raise police suspicion. Linda Hoffman sued the Ramseys for defamation in 2002 after the release of their book, Death of Innocence, but the judge dismissed the case. What do you think happened to Jonbenet? Hopefully one day, justice will be done. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing to Hell is Empty, and check out my other long videos on Jack the Ripper and Lizzie Borden.